So we hit on it a little bit, but go back to it here is transcribing. So I have transcribing versus using the score in jazz, and then what about in classical?
We were having this interesting discussion. One of the ways, the primary ways that jazz artists develop their skills by listening to the legendary recordings of all time and listening very, very attentively and charting out or learning note for note off of the recording so that they can develop the same harmonic and melodic and rhythmic language as the artists that they love. And of course, the question becomes at that point, for example, if you have a jazz composition, and there are some pieces that are jazz, but they're written, and in a way that is classical, although it's a branch of classical, just as Baroque music is as different from minimalism, for example.
Jazz compositions that are through composed?
Yeah, exactly. Something that's completely written out. And if you wanted to learn that, would you transcribe it by ear, or would, if the score was available? And you've told me you'd rather transcribe it because you'll learn it better that way.
Yeah, I think the subject of through composed compositions might be a little bit different in the sense that, well, that's a lot of stuff that's happening today. That's the more modern kind of chamber-like compositional methods. So that, I don't know if you'd want to transcribe. Actually, I think you would still. I would still do it.
But once you say that, my next question is, if it's better and you can digest a score better by listening to it and fleshing it out, why wouldn't the same thing be true with classical?
Well, before I answer that, I will say with solos, transcribing without a doubt. And I think also the term transcribing is misunderstood. When we say transcribing, it doesn't mean the literal act of writing down.
You might write it out. You might just learn it, the sound, and memorize it as you go.
Right. It's more of a immersion, process of internalization, and really, actually, with jazz solos, I mean, I'll say the goal with transcribing is you want to absorb the feel of the player. You want to really feel their articulation, their phrasing, their rhythm, their time, their concept, and kind of get into their head. If you're reading it on a paper, it's more the process of like learning a classical etude than really absorbing and learning and really understanding and internalizing the player. Can't remember where I was going with this.
Well, the question is, though, I keep wondering, because obviously classical music, you've got the score. The score is the holy grail, and you know it. And of course, since it's open to interpretation, unless you are listening to the composer's performance. So theoretically, if you were studying a work that there is a recording of the artist playing it, like a piece of Rachmaninoff that he recorded, or something more recent where there's even a cleaner recording of, do you think you would be better off learning it by ear rather than learning it from the score?
No, and I'll tell you why. I think first, on the issue of a classical composition versus a jazz solo, I think it's a little bit different in the sense that one is a solo and one is a composition.
Well, I was talking about...
But even composition.
Composition. Because obviously solo is a different thing, and I get that.
Right.
But this is where I'm trying to figure out what the benefit is and why it wouldn't translate to classical.
So I'll just ask, when we're talking about jazz composition, do you mean like a standard that, you know, the 32 bar A, B, A type tune?
When I say composition, I mean where every note is written out. And there are such jazz works that are completely written out. And it crosses a line. I guess you go back to Gershwin, you know, even Scott Joplin. We just had Johnny May on our YouTube channel. And of course, Scott Joplin is ragtime, which is early form of jazz. But Scott Joplin wrote everything out. So there's a kind of an overlap between classical and jazz. But if learning something that's all written out in the jazz world is better doing it from transcribing it rather than by reading it, then why wouldn't that be also true for classical? What's the distinction, the defining factor that makes it beneficial for one and not the other?
Yeah. Well, with learning tunes and learning standards, I think definitely by ear and transcribing. But with through composed jazz compositions, I would, if a student was asking me whether they should transcribe it or whether they should learn it off a page, I think that one can be up to the person. I don't think, I mean, the advantages of transcribing that aren't as much as with transcribing a standard or transcribing a solo.
It's a
But-
heck of a lot more work, isn't it?
Right. Well, actually, that's though where it kind of that depends on the person, because I find it with a solo, with standard, or with through composed compositions in the jazz world, I find that I learn it better.
You might
absorb
understand it
and
better
understand
from
it
hearing
better.
the performance. Well, jazz.
Well, not just
yeah.
hearing the performance, but from transcribing it myself too.
Right.
Because if I'm learning it from a page, then it's more of a process of the brain. Whereas if I'm transcribing it, internalizing it, it's more of something that's within me. And it's when they say play from your soul or whatever, I guess that's what that may be.